What if the most powerful prayer ever spoken wasn't meant to be heard by anyone around you, but by something ancient and infinite, sleeping quietly inside you? There is a moment, recorded in the oldest manuscripts we have, where Jesus steps away from the crowds, not to rest, not to eat, but to pray. And what's strange, what most people never stop to notice, is that no one knows what he said. The disciples watched from a distance. They saw something happen to him in those hours of silence. And when he returned, he healed the sick, calmed storms, and spoke with an authority that left even scholars speechless. So here is the question that has haunted mystics, philosophers, and quiet seekers for 2,000 years. What was he actually doing in those moments of solitude? What was the prayer that changed everything? If this question stirs something in you, drop the word awaken in the comments right now. You'll understand why by the end of this video. And if you've ever felt like your prayers disappear into silence, like you're speaking to a ceiling rather than to something real, then stay with me. Because what we're about to explore isn't a religious debate. It isn't theology. It is something older, stranger, and far more personal than any doctrine. It is the hidden mechanics of how consciousness touches the divine. The early followers of Jesus preserved something that never made it into the official story. Texts buried in the Egyptian desert for nearly 2,000 years. Traditions passed in whispers between initiates. A way of prayer so different from what we were taught that when people first encounter it, they don't call it prayer at all. They call it transformation. Before we go any further, if this kind of deep, forgotten wisdom is what you come here for, let that like button know. It genuinely helps this knowledge reach the people who are ready for it. Now, let's go back much further back than Sunday school, much further back than church councils and official creeds, to the world where Jesus himself was shaped. Because to understand what he was doing alone on that mountain, we first have to understand the extraordinary spiritual world he was born into. And nothing will ever look quite the same again. 1 p.m. To understand the secret of Jesus's prayer, we have to travel back to a world that most history books skip over entirely. Not to Rome, not to Jerusalem's marble temples, but to the dusty crossroads of the ancient Near East. A place where Greek philosophy, Egyptian mystery traditions, Persian mysticism, and Jewish esoteric wisdom were colliding, merging, and giving birth to entirely new ways of understanding God, consciousness, and the human soul. Jesus was born into this world, and it was a world on fire with ideas. The Jewish tradition he inherited was not the simple linear faith that later centuries would present it as. Hidden beneath the surface of the Torah, running like an underground river, was a current of mystical practice known as Merkaba, the tradition of the divine chariot. Practitioners of this tradition weren't satisfied with worshipping God from a distance. They sought direct experience. They developed techniques, breathwork, inner visualization, the repetition of sacred names, to ascend through layers of consciousness until they stood, in their inner experience, before the throne of the living God itself. This was not metaphor to them. This was the most real thing a human being could do. And then there was Alexandria, that magnificent, restless city where the library held the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. Here, Jewish mystics sat beside Greek Platonists and Egyptian priests, and they discovered something that electrified all of them equally. Plato had spoken of the One, the ultimate, ineffable source from which all existence flows, a reality so pure and complete that it cannot even be properly named or described. The Egyptian tradition had its own version, and the Jewish Kabbalistic stream was reaching toward the same summit from yet another direction. They were all, it seemed, pointing at the same sun. The philosopher Plotinus, writing in the 3rd century, described moments of mystical union, experiences where the boundary between the self and the infinite simply dissolved. He didn't call it prayer in any conventional sense. He called it the flight of the alone to the alone, a return, a remembering of what the soul had always been, beneath the noise of ordinary life. What is extraordinary is that Plotinus described exactly the kind of inner state that the Gnostic gospel attribute to Jesus, a state of such perfect inner stillness and union with the source that miracles weren't acts of supernatural intervention. They were the natural overflow of a consciousness, fully aligned with the ground of all being. And this brings us to something the early Gnostic Christians understood with stunning clarity. They made a distinction, a radical one, between two kinds of prayer. The first kind is what most of us were taught. You speak words, you ask for things, you direct your request upward like a letter sent to a distant address, and then you wait. This kind of prayer has its place, but the Gnostics saw it as the outer court of the temple, not the inner sanctum. The second kind of prayer, the kind they associated with Jesus in his most private, most powerful moments, had no words at all. It was a prayer of being rather than asking, a prayer of presence rather than petition. The Valentinian Gnostics, one of the most philosophically sophisticated of the early Christian streams, taught that the deepest form of communion with the divine wasn't achieved through language. Language, they said, belongs to the world of separation, the world where you are here and God is somewhere else. But in the place of true prayer, that distance collapses. There is a passage in the Gospel of Philip, one of the texts discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, that stops many readers cold the first time they encounter it. It suggests that the names we give to sacred things are veils, not windows, that the truth behind the name of the Father, the name of the Son, is something that cannot be grasped by the ordinary thinking mind. It must be experienced from within. This was not heresy. This was the inner tradition, the flame that burns at the center of every authentic mystical path, regardless of the outer form it wears. And Jesus, in his solitary hours on the mountain, in the wilderness, in the garden, was living that flame. He wasn't asking, he was becoming. And the world around him responded accordingly. So what exactly was this prayer? What were the actual mechanics of what Jesus was doing in those hours of sacred solitude? To understand it, we need to move past the idea that prayer is fundamentally a verbal act. We need to enter a different model of reality entirely, one that the ancient world took for granted and that modern science, from a completely different direction, is beginning to rediscover. In the worldview that shaped Jesus, the universe was not a collection of separate objects floating in empty space. It was a single living emanation, a continuous outpouring of divine consciousness, flowing from an ultimate source that the Gnostics called the monad, the one, the invisible Father. Everything that exists, every stone, every star, every human soul, was understood as a ripple in that one infinite ocean. Separation was the illusion. Unity was the truth underneath. Now here is where it becomes extraordinary. If this is the nature of reality, if you and the source of all existence are not fundamentally separate, then prayer is not communication across a distance. Prayer is the act of remembering that the distance was never real. It is not reaching out, it is returning inward. The Gnostic teacher Valentinus, who lived in the 2nd century and was by all accounts one of the most brilliant theological minds of the ancient world, taught that the human being carries within itself a spark, a divine seed that is literally of the same nature as the ultimate source. He called it the pneuma, the spirit, and he taught that the tragedy of ordinary human existence is that we have forgotten what we carry. We walk through life like kings who have lost their memory, living as beggars in their own kingdom. The prayer that Jesus practiced, the prayer that the inner tradition has always pointed toward, was the practice of remembering, of turning the attention away from the noise of the external world and returning it steadily and completely to that divine spark at the center of one's own being. And this is where the sacred name becomes crucial. In the ancient world, names were not labels. They were living realities. To speak the true name of something was to touch its essence, to establish a resonance with it at the deepest level. The Hebrew tradition understood this with particular intensity. The name of God, the unpronounceable tetragrammaton, was not merely a word, it was a frequency, a vibration that, when contacted in the right inner state, aligned the entire human system with the divine ground of existence. The Gnostic texts speak of a sacred name that was used by Jesus and passed to his closest disciples as a living key. That name was Iao, a name that appears not only in Gnostic Christianity, but in Egyptian mystical practice, in the Greek magical papyri, and in traditions scattered across the ancient Mediterranean world. It was understood as a name that contained within its 3 sounds the full mystery of divine being, the beginning, the middle, and the end, the breath of existence itself compressed into a single sacred syllable. When the ancient practitioner worked with this name, not merely repeating it mechanically, but entering into it with full inner attention, allowing it to resonate through the entire being, something happened that went far beyond ordinary religious experience. The boundaries of the ordinary self began to thin. The constant mental chatter, the fears, the desires, the sense of being a small and isolated creature in a vast indifferent universe, all of it began to quiet. And in that quieting, something else became perceptible, something that had always been present but buried beneath the noise. The mystics of every tradition describe this moment in almost identical terms, regardless of the language they use or the century they lived in. There is a quality of luminous stillness, a sense of presence so full and so intimate that it cannot be doubted. And with it, and this is what the Gnostic tradition insists upon with extraordinary emphasis, a spontaneous arising of what can only be called knowing. Not intellectual knowledge, not belief, but direct, immediate recognition of one's own nature as an expression of the divine. This is what the Gospel of Thomas points toward when it records Jesus saying that the kingdom is not somewhere you go. It is already spread across the earth, and people simply do not see it. The prayer was never about changing God's mind. It was about changing the lens through which reality is perceived. And when that lens clears, when the inner eye opens, the world that was always miraculous becomes for the first time visible as such. There is something that the official story never quite explains, and once you notice it, you cannot unnotice it. The miracles of Jesus in the Gospels follow a pattern, and that pattern reveals something profound about the nature of what was actually happening. He never performed a miracle from a place of effort. There is no straining, no negotiating, no desperate pleading with a distant God to intervene. The healing of the blind man, the raising of Lazarus, the calming of the storm. In every case, what precedes the miracle is not exertion, but a quality of absolute stillness and certainty. A state of being so complete, so rooted in an inner reality, that the outer world simply rearranges itself in response. The Gnostic tradition had a specific word for this state. They called it gnosis, but not in the academic sense that word is often used today. Gnosis was not a set of beliefs. It was not a philosophy you could learn from a book. It was a direct experiential recognition of one's true nature as an expression of the divine source. And the tradition insisted, with striking unanimity across its many branches, that this recognition was not reserved for one exceptional individual in history. It was the birthright of every human soul. This is the teaching that made the Gnostics dangerous to the established powers of their age. Because if gnosis, if direct inner access to the divine, is available to every person, then the entire apparatus of external religious authority becomes, at best, a helpful pointer, and at worst, an obstacle. You do not need a mediator between yourself and the source of your own being. You need only the courage and the commitment to turn inward and look. The Gospel of Philip articulates this with quiet, devastating precision. It suggests that those who say the divine is in the sky are wrong. The birds would find it first. Those who say it is in the sea are wrong. The fish would find it first. The kingdom is within you and all around you, simultaneously interior and intimate, and woven into the very fabric of what exists. Now here is where we encounter one of the most profound and least discussed dimensions of Jesus' prayer practice, the relationship between consciousness and what the ancient world called pneuma, the breath of life, the animating spirit that flows through all living things. The Hebrew word for spirit, ruach, is the same word for wind and breath. This was not a coincidence or a linguistic accident. The ancient understanding was that breath and spirit operate on the same principle. Both are invisible, both are in constant motion, both sustain life, and both, when consciously directed, become extraordinary instruments of inner transformation. The contemplative traditions that surrounded Jesus, the essence of the Dead Sea, the Jewish mystics practicing Merkaba ascent, the Egyptian initiates working with what they called the breath of Amun. All of them understood that conscious, intentional breathing was not merely a physiological act. It was a spiritual technology, a way of bringing the scattered, fragmented attention of the ordinary mind into a single unified point of presence. When the attention is unified, when the endless inner commentary of the mind falls into silence, something astonishing happens. The practitioner begins to perceive what has always been there beneath the surface of ordinary awareness. The Gnostics called it the light of the pleroma, the fullness of divine being that underlies and permeates all of creation. Plotinus called it the One. The Upanishads called it Brahman. The Taoists called it the Tao. Different languages, different cultures, different centuries, but the same pointing finger, aimed at the same invisible moon. And here is what the Nag Hammadi texts reveal that is truly stunning. The prayer that the inner circle of Jesus' followers practiced was not a single technique, but a constellation of practices working together. Sacred sound, working with names and tones that produced specific inner resonances. Sacred breath, using the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation as a vehicle for deepening presence. And sacred silence, the crown of the entire practice, the moment when sound and breath dissolve into pure, wordless awareness, and the practitioner simply rests in the recognition of what they have always been. This threefold structure appears, in varying forms, in virtually every genuine mystical tradition on earth. It is as if the inner architecture of the human being responds to this particular sequence the way a lock responds to its key. The miracle was never the endpoint. The miracle was the symptom, the natural, inevitable expression of a consciousness that had returned, however briefly, to its source. Like water that has been heated past a certain point cannot help but become steam. A consciousness aligned with the divine source cannot help but express the qualities of that source: wholeness, healing, clarity, love. Jesus was not doing something impossible. He was demonstrating what becomes possible when the prayer goes all the way in. Everything we have explored so far, the sacred names, the inner stillness, the breath, the dissolution of the boundary between self and source, none of it was meant to remain as philosophy. The ancient teachers were not interested in giving people beautiful ideas to think about. They were interested in transformation, and transformation only happens through practice. So let us bring this all the way down to earth. The first and most important shift is not a technique. It is a reorientation of understanding. Most of us approach prayer or meditation or any inner practice with the unconscious assumption that we are small, and God, or the divine, or the source is large and somewhere else. We approach from a position of lack, of distance, of unworthiness, and that very assumption shapes the entire inner experience before we have even begun. The Gnostic understanding invites you to try something radically different. Before you begin any practice, sit for a moment with this single recognition: what you are seeking is not outside you. It has never been outside you. The divine spark that Valentina spoke of, the pneuma, the inner light, it is not something you need to acquire or earn or be granted. It is what you already are, beneath every layer of thought, fear, and habit that has accumulated over a lifetime. You are not trying to reach God. You are trying to remember that you have never been separate from the source of your own existence. Let that settle before you continue reading. Because if it lands, even partially, even as a quiet intuition rather than a certainty, it will change the quality of everything that follows. The second element is breath, not controlled breathing in any complicated sense. Simply this: sit quietly, close your eyes, and for a few minutes, give your full, gentle attention to the natural rhythm of your own breathing. Not changing it, not forcing it, simply noticing it. Inhalation, a moment of stillness at the top; exhalation, a moment of stillness at the bottom. What you will discover, if you stay with this long enough, is that those moments of stillness between the breaths are extraordinary. They are like small windows that open onto something vast and quiet. The ancient practitioners knew this. The pause between the breaths was considered sacred space, a momentary dissolution of the ordinary self, a brief but real contact with the ground of being. The third element is sacred sound. You do not need to use the name IAO to work with this principle, though if it resonates with you, it can be a powerful focus. The underlying principle is this: choose a single sacred word or name or sound that carries genuine meaning for you. It might be a name of the divine from your own tradition. It might be a single syllable, like the universal sound of Om, which the Hindu tradition describes as the primordial vibration of existence itself. What matters is not the specific form, but the quality of attention you bring to it. Repeat it inwardly, not as a mechanical repetition but as a return. Each time the mind wanders, which it will, you simply return to the sound, gently, without frustration, without judgment. The wandering of the mind is not failure. The return is the practice, and each return, the mystics insist, is itself a small act of prayer, a small turning of the heart back toward its source. The fourth and final element is the one that most people skip, because it asks the most of us: silence. After working with breath and sacred sound, there comes a moment when the practitioner is invited to let go of even the sacred word, to release every technique, every support, and simply rest as awareness itself, without content, without agenda, without the need for anything to be different from what it is. This is what the contemplative traditions call pure prayer. It is not asking, it is not even seeking. It is the soul resting in its own deepest nature, which is identical to the nature of the source from which it came. You may only touch this for a few seconds at first. That is enough. A few seconds of genuine inner silence carries more transformative power than hours of agitated petition. Because in those seconds you are not performing prayer, you are living it. Begin with 5 minutes, then 10, then allow the practice to find its own natural duration. What you are building, slowly and surely, is not a skill, it is a recognition, and once recognized, it cannot be entirely forgotten. 2,000 years ago, a man walked out of the wilderness after 40 days of profound inner silence, and the world he returned to was somehow different. Not because the world had changed, but because the eyes looking at it had. This is the secret that no council ever voted on, that no institution ever canonized, that no decree ever managed to fully erase. Even when the texts were buried, even when the teachers were silenced, even when the traditions were driven underground and scattered like seeds on the wind, the seeds always grow back. What we have explored together in this video is not a new idea dressed in ancient clothing. It is the oldest living current in the human spiritual experience. The recognition that the divine is not a distant authority to be appeased, but an intimate reality to be discovered. That prayer at its deepest is not the words we speak, but the silence we are willing to enter. That the miracles attributed to Jesus were not violations of natural law, but demonstrations of what natural law looks like when consciousness operates from its fullest, most unified depth. You were never meant to pray at the divine from the outside. You were always meant to pray from within it. And perhaps that is the most quietly revolutionary thing this ancient tradition has to offer. A world that is tired of noise, tired of performance, tired of spirituality that stays on the surface and never touches the root. The invitation is simply this: go inward. Go deeper than your thoughts, deeper than your fears, deeper than the story you have told yourself about who you are and what you deserve, and how close or far you are from the sacred. At the very bottom of that descent, every genuine mystic who has ever lived reports the same discovery. Not emptiness, not absence, but a presence so full, so luminous, so irreducibly alive, that the only honest response is silence. And from that silence, everything becomes possible. If this video opens something in you, a question, a longing, a quiet recognition, then let it live. Don't rush to close it with an easy answer. Sit with it, breathe with it. Let it lead you somewhere you haven't been before. Drop your reflections in the comments below. Tell me what stirred in you. Tell me what you want to explore next. This conversation is just beginning, and the people finding their way to this kind of wisdom deserve to find each other. The prayer they didn't want you to know was never hidden in a vault or locked behind a secret door. It was hidden in plain sight, in the silence between your breaths, in the stillness beneath your thoughts, in the ancient unbroken light at the center of what you already are. It has been waiting for you to remember,